each of you, just by way of starting on this final discussion, how do you see the roles of the organisations that you represent in contributing to both the integration and then the implementation of all of this? How do you, Sharon, see the role of trade unions in particular? You have a mic there.
Thank you. Well, for trade unions, social protection is core business. I think if you look at any developed country, then the origins of social protection, while not exclusively the advocacy of trade unions, has nevertheless come out of partnerships between the more progressive end of the spectrum of governments and indeed labour advocacy, supported of course by friendly folk within the broader civil society quest. When we set out to raise the social protection issue again, and particularly the social protection floor, it was actually done in partnership with the ILO and indeed the UN through the Michelle Bachelet report. And we gathered, as we always do, champions around the issue. So Helen Clark was fundamental. We even went into the halls of business at Davos and even got the IMF and the World Bank, although sometimes we don't like the implementation strategies they have, to champion this issue. And can I just say that for us, this is about social justice. There's no doubt about that. We're in the 21st century, and the fact that 75% of the world's people have no or inadequate social protection, despite an increase in GDP over the last 40-odd years of some threefold plus, is a travesty. There's no question. The models simply got out of whack. But it's also for us, in terms of the SDGs, got to be economically and socially transformational. And we think it underpins the three elements of environment, economic and social ambitions for a just economy. So for us, we're there in advocacy, but we're also there in implementation. Many of our unions actually run social security systems, sometimes as a partnership with government, sometimes where it doesn't exist. People told us we couldn't organise domestic workers, but I was just Friday, lost track of time, in Copenhagen with some of our representatives working in the informal sector, a vital standards initiative at the ILO this year. And I can point to people, for example, an amazing woman called Alta Gracia who, with her union, built a social security system for domestic workers in the Dominican Republic. These are small examples of a lot of hard work going on. Siwa from India has built whole cooperatives and social protection measures, including services. But they'll all say to you, that's not a replacement for a systematic, tax-based social justice measure that underpins both the economy and its people. And as we move towards the climate crisis increasingly, that we're seeing it's just as essential for a just transition to a sustainable future on the climate front as it is in terms of people's livelihoods and the economy more broadly.
Very much. So those key roles and advocacy, the communication of all of this, we have talked about a great deal today, and I'd like to get some more thoughts from you on that. And as you say, key implementers, but not as a substitute. We'll come back on those issues. Roberto, we've talked quite a lot, and I think you've been here and heard the discussion. We talked particularly in the high-level panel about the role of the private sector, or the potential role of the private sector. How do you see the role of employers and the private sector in delivering on this agenda?
May I just, thank you.
Please do.
May I just go back to the role of employers' organization, and I go back to the point of Sharon. I think now with the new post-2015, if it's approved, that it seems to be the national ownership and the national component is key, and involvement of key partners is going to be an element of success. And we have to say that on this specific area, the social partners have already done a lot of work in the last years. So that's something that has already been a key to some extent and shouldn't be neglected. Of course, for that, you need culture, you need maturity, you need responsibility, you need also reinforcements of capacity of social partners. Sometimes this is forgotten. But I also have to say something that perhaps Sharon hasn't said, I don't know if because of shyness or what, But also, employers and workers are the ones that are contributing to some extent to many of the social protection. That's not just about cost, and we have been discussing that, but it's an important element. And to some extent also, and you can also be in any country discussing how high the employers' contributions are and how important it is to reduce it. So to some extent, this involvement is also for this important. But the third element is precisely the one that you have already underlined. I mean, we have been discussing today, well, the limitations in terms of, well, there is fiscal space, but at the end of the day, we won't really to go with an ambitious approach with social protection schemes or social protection floors. At the end of the day, you need resource mobilization. And of course, the role of the private sector, I think, modestly speaking, is important. But we have been saying that for years, to some extent, and we always have the same difficulties, and we already have some experiences of working together in partnership with the private sector, and there are important challenges in terms of communications, in terms of language, and in terms of logic. Sometimes we have to understand that the logic is different, but they have to some extent to converge. For cities specific, and those are critical elements where, again, modestly speaking, the employees' organizations also can contribute.
Okay, thank you. I want to come back to some of those, not barriers, but hurdles maybe that sometimes need to be overcome and when we come into the discussion. But before I do that, Bogdan Vanden, from an NGO perspective, and you're an NGO, you launched a campaign on this issue earlier this year, I know. How do you see the role of NGOs in this and the key challenges that we now face in order to really deliver on this agenda?
Well, I can say that a lot of the things that Sharon already mentioned are similar for NGOs. And we are indeed very proud that we have established a broad coalition for a campaign on social protection in Belgium. Not just NGOs, but also trade unions, mutuals are in there, and NGOs from all kind of with all kind of visions, also NGOs which are affiliated with organizations of small entrepreneurs and farmers. So, I mean, this is a very large and broad coalition, and we have a common agenda, and this I think, is already a good thing, and it's a good thing for certain things, for certain reasons, but one of the main reasons, it has already been raised here, I think, is for mobilization and communication on the importance of social protection within our own society. But of course, as NGOs, we are very active in the Global South, so also within the Global South. But this mobilization and communication is one of the main aspects of the campaigns as well. And I think it's very important that we communicate that social protection is not a burden, but it's a blessing, or it's an investment, as Guy Ryder said earlier. We have some work there in Belgium. But then, of course, we also have to mobilize and organize in southern countries, bringing together vulnerable groups of people which are deprived of social protection, strengthening their capacities, building social protection from below, where government don't live up their obligations. We can do things, but as said by Sharon, we should not substitute. It's just temporary. And we can reach a lot of people. As said, a very important part is reaching people in the informal sector. We as NGOs have done a lot of work there and have some experience on it. So I think those are key elements to make it work.
Thank you.
I have other things here.
Sure, no, we've got time to discuss them. On this communications point, if I could just pick up on that. We started this morning, and Tom Howes was saying we need to convince the unconvinced. And then someone from the audience said, who are the unconvinced? Where is the problem? And if we're going to know how to, it's really a question to all of you, because the communication of this issue and how you portray it, do you portray it as an investment, as a sound economic policy because it benefits the economy? Do you portray it more in terms of the human rights issue? How do you get this? And I want to come back to it in this last panel, because you've identified it as a key part of your role. And I just want to see how you see, who is it that you need to, who is the target for those communications, and what do you think is the right message to be sending? And Sharon, a thought from you on that as well, if you could, because you talked about advocacy being a key part of your job.
Well, I mean, if we have this broad coalition, we will be targeting the broad public.
Yeah.
And I think Well, the situation will be different in every country, I think. But in Belgium, when we started up with our coalition and we started to discuss the agenda, we had the idea that, to sum it up, I mean, there are a lot of things that can be said about it, but to sum it up, it was that maybe in Belgium it has become evident. I mean, not evident. I can't find the word.
You mean évident in the French sense
yes,
of it?
Yes.
Taken for granted.
It's taken for granted. It's taken for granted, and people don't even know anymore that there is a huge and strong social protection system in Belgium, and it works so smoothly that they don't see it sometimes. And that's one of the things we can maybe articulate. It's completely different, of course, in southern countries where people can see exactly what happens when you invest in social protection. But that is one of the things we identified.
Yeah,
and I forgot the other part of the question.
In terms of what the message should be.
Well, yes. Well, the message should be it is a human right to have social protection, and everybody has the right on social protection. And I think we can say that if you are born in Belgium, you are quite lucky to have this social protection. If you are born in another country, well, you have a lot less chance to have this social protection, and I think people are open to that. And
that's interesting because we talked a lot about the rights-based approach, but a rights-based approach to communication, less. The emphasis has been more today, so far, Sharon, on talking about it being an investment in the economy and essential, and pointing out, for example, that countries with good social protection systems have weathered the economic crisis better than those that have not. How would you frame the argument? And can I just ask also how you make that case and how important you believe, because you're you're the International Confederation, that it is part of this global agenda, that even though different situations in different countries, we've talked a lot about needing to have tailor-made approaches, local ownership and so on, that it needs to be part of this global agenda. How do you see that? And a similar question to you, Roberto, because you both represent international bodies, so that global perspective, how important is it?
Well, first of all, let me say that everybody, it doesn't matter whether you're in a developed or a developing economy, is one pay packet away from potential disaster for yourselves and your families. It's one climate tragedy away from disaster for you and your families and often your communities. It's one economic crisis away from disaster, no matter what economy you're in. So if we're serious about what kind of world we want to live in, and we have just taxation systems for which people pay from the wealth they generate, notwithstanding Roberto's point that we often make additional or where it's not evident joint contributions. But if you're talking about the social protection floor, which is my passion, let me compliment the Belgian community, because I think every country has to defend social protection now in the wake of a deliberate attack, particularly from the IMF and the World Bank, but mostly from the IMF in the context of an economic crisis that wasn't of people's making. And if ever they needed social protection, it was then. I actually find it very difficult to understand why Europe hasn't laid greater demands or disparagement on the doors of the Troika in that regard. But having said that we're all one pay packet or one disaster of another away from disaster, who do you have to convince? You don't have to convince families. You don't have to convince migrant workers that this is the solution for them to get a decent start in a country when they've been displaced by conflict or economic trauma. You certainly don't have to convince anybody in my world, whether they're in the informal economy or the formal economy. So, I mean, let's get over the rights approach. It's there, but it's much more than a rights approach. If people don't want to accept that, which I must say we should be pushing much harder back on, then the economic stats are there. You said it. You know, anybody who had a robust social protection system got through the crisis more. But go back in history. In the 1890s, Sweden was poor. It was actually poor. If you listen to generations of Norwegian prime ministers from both sides of politics, they will argue quietly that it's not their oil that's given them wealth. They've got a sovereign wealth fund, but that's not used to prop up their society. They've actually built their wealth collectively with progressive taxation, social protection systems, affording things as they can go. Now, if we have the growth in GDP, notwithstanding the financial crisis knocked off some amount of it, it's still there. If we have it, if we have the theft of money by wealthy corporations from developing economies, we need to do several things. We need to communicate the urgent need to back in, I might say, the G7 and the G20, ironically, on this question about renovating taxation systems. Pay where you earn the money. It's that simple. Secondly, what's it for? If we don't have a social protection floor, you don't have a decent community. And we're talking about the integrated package, not a little bit here and there, although I could argue that some emergency measures make a big difference. But if you don't have a society, think about ours. If you don't have a society where you have unemployment benefits, pensions, child protection, health, education, maternity protection, what have I forgotten? Sanitation, housing, education for all. They're the Bachelet report elements. I don't think I forgot any. Then if you don't have those things, what do you have for all the wealth that we generate, all the work and the labour that people put into our economies? And of course, if you really want to bring out the economist in me, then the multiplier impact is there as well. The stats are in. So the only people we have to convince are governments who've listened to an orthodox thinking that is wrong economically, is just appalling socially. And if we're serious, we will build a global fund to kickstart the social protection floor in developing economies, because it does need to be kickstarted. It's sustainable, and Guy and other experts in the room can tell you over what period, but certainly over a decade, you can see models that show that this is sustainable and builds a fundamental economic base as well as sustainability. And if we didn't care about any of that, let's care about conflict, because if we don't sort some of the conflicts in the world, where young people have simply given up, where older workers and women are so desperate now that, particularly for our youth, fundamentalist causes are attractive, then we're crazy about shaping the world that we want for the future.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Roberto, from the point of view of employers and their role in this communications message, do you think, I mean, those who accept the argument that it is an investment, not a cost, that it is sound economic policy to have social protection, do they need to do more and speak up more in this area? And just coming to this question of we're talking today obviously about the UN agenda and the global agenda, and the fact that now the whole approach is to have a universal approach, that it'll apply to developed countries and to developing countries at the same time. Just going back to that question from earlier, as you're an international organisation, this question of if no one size fits all, if things have to be local ownership, tailor-made, why would you argue it's so important to have this as part of a global agenda?
Which is the first question you asked already to Sharon.
Exactly.
Let me talk as a representative of a business community itself. I think it's important for the business community itself that the social protection development in general, not just for a specific country, try to reduce inequalities among countries. And that's also important in terms of, it's not just a question of good investment or of profit-oriented approach, but it's also a question of middle and long-term sustainability of investment. And that's why we as employers community, we supported the social protection floor approach. Because at the end of the day, and I have to say, we are very critical as employers with some of the, and I don't have any shyness to say that, with some of the ILO conventions on social security. I have been dealing with them, they're very technical, they're very complex. But the social protection floor recommendations made a difference, because it goes really to basic things. Education, it goes to health, it goes to elderly people and employees, etc. That's where really you have, as international community, be focusing.
Mike.
Sorry.
You're getting excited.
But having said that, of course there are many people unconvinced. And to some extent, well, we can agree on the right-based approach, etc., but at the end of the day, the problem, and we have been discussing that, is the how. How do you really put that into place? And you have governments very reluctant, and also part of the business community that is reluctant, because that could mean increase of taxes, and also, I would say also many workers and many citizens in general. The key and crucial element for me could be to make, and you already mentioned that, the business case at the end of the day. How really, and you have to provide very specific example, how this and you in this specific local context, provide a real multiplying effect for the economy. How this really reinforce the active policies, which sometimes are not efficient at all. I mean, the active labor market policy, how really dynamize the labor market, and social protection has a key role there. How this really promote transitions towards formality, and we are talking about countries with 80% of their employees in the informal economy. How do you really improve the access to finance to many people using, to some extent, social protection? And how do you complement wages to some extent and increase the consumption capacity of citizens to that? Those and many other elements will really help in terms of communication to the reluctant guys.
Thank you. I want to come back on how, from each of your perspectives, you see the challenges in the final stages of negotiation on the SDGs, and also then in terms of implementation, how you see it. And I'll start with you on that, Bogdan. But first of all, a last chance, ladies and gentlemen, today to raise a question or make a point if you have one. Yes, please, sir, and can you introduce yourself? Yeah. Thank you.
Charles Knox-Widmanov from Help Age International. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of mention a couple of practical kind of points which I think have come up and I think are important in terms of civil society's role in terms of social protection. One, there was a discussion of who to target, who are those who disagree and who to target in terms of social protection. I think just to say, from Help Age's experience of advocating on this and our partners' experience of advocating on social protection at a national level, I'd really echo the comment made up there that it's not about just influencing the Minister of Social Protection or the Minister of Finance, as it's often kind of framed, but it's this, countries moving ahead on social protection is part of a much broader change in mentality towards what that is. And our experience is that, it has to be a much more sustained, broader influencing process with MPs, with people from across, the spectrum of government, from technocrats up to politicians, etc., academia, civil society. So it has to be a much more broad, concerted campaign. The second thing I just wanted to emphasize, which I think is really important, which is a function of civil society, which I don't think has been mentioned so much, is that of monitoring existing social protection, and particularly grassroots monitoring of existing social protection schemes. And I think that's something that there's increasing opportunity for as more and more countries put in place social protection schemes that can actually be used as a reference point for really pushing further expansion.
Thank you very much. And that point you made about the sustained and broader campaign really goes right back when Ambassador Frankenet was talking this morning about galvanizing the broader public as well as governments being one of the objectives. Now, I see one right at the back there, sir. So, let me just take a quick sprint, as we don't have all that much time. Very good for me. Very good exercise, as I didn't make it to the gym today. Here we are. Thank you very much. No problem at all. It's good for me.
On n'a pas trop parlé, et ça m'a étonné pendant toute cette conférence, de l'importance dans la gouvernance de la protection sociale de bons services sociaux au sens large, publics et privés. Alors je serais très intéressé d'avoir le point de vue de chacun des orateurs du panel sur la façon dont ils voient la coexistence des uns et des autres. Et dans les services, services publics, je vise là-dedans tout ce qui est pris en charge par les administrations, mais alors il y a tout le rôle du secteur privé, et là il y a beaucoup plus d'équivoques, de sous-entendus, de malentendus. Donc comment Madame Burrow voit la coexistence du rôle des organisations syndicales avec des ONG qui, avec les meilleures intentions du monde, sont déjà présents dans beaucoup de pays pour combler des besoins. Et parfois, les mauvaises langues disent plus ça dure pour elles, plus elles sont contentes, mais on ne va pas nécessairement vers des solutions durables. Comment est-ce que le représentant des employeurs voit la coexistence du rôle du secteur privé des entreprises avec... Et est-ce qu'il est partisan d'une libéralisation plus grande des services sociaux pour prouver que les employeurs investissent l'économie réelle, par exemple? Ça ne sera pas du goût de Madame Burrow, sans doute. Et alors, secteur coopération-développement, comment voyez-vous la durabilité des services offerts par les ONG du développement dans un système plus global et responsable, je veux dire plus pris en charge par les gouvernements.
Merci beaucoup. And thank you for bringing that up. I mean, Fabio touched on it in the last session, but I think important to come back on that question. So, Sharon, in terms of public services and the role of trade unions, the role of NGOs, and how you see that balance, just a comment on that. It's a very specific question, and then we'll come back to the challenges in terms of social protection more broadly.
Well, the role of public services is critical. It's what I shorthand call what sort of society do we want. If you take one target alone, even take it just out of the provision of social protection systems, and look at the target that all your governments have signed up to, of an increase of 25% of women's participation in the labour force by 2025, then you won't achieve it if the systems that provide facilitation provision like childcare, aged care, depending on the demographics, health, education are not in place. So these things are critical. They're critical for any decent society, but they're critical to achieve even those kind of economic targets. And I want to make it clear that on those questions, then, you know, Roberto's right. The IOE and the ITC have very little difference. We jointly put this issue and the formalisation of the informal economy on the G20 agenda. We've backed in the G7, the work at the OECD, the work at the ILO, and the work at the UN. So, frankly, we think it's critical, but you can't do it entirely without social dialogue, and you can't do it entirely without a partnership with civil society. But social dialogue, if you look at our history, in almost all countries, has been the heart, or indeed just labour struggles, have been the heart of some of the social protection systems development. In my own country, I could count the number of times we've defended our Medicare, which is your health mutual system. In fact, I think your health system is one of the best in the world. I would proudly say Australia is one of the best in the world, and I now live with yours, so, you know, I think you should be proud of that as Belgians, those of you from here. But you know, we have to fight to defend those things even when they're in existence. And a lot of the higher social protection systems, we're not talking about the floor, but the higher social protection systems that have held us in good stead have been, in fact, often deferred wages. You know, we talk about making a contribution. I get very anxious when people talk about social insurance systems. I mean, if that's the way we describe the management of deferred wages, such as our pension funds and so on, fine. Although I have some, you know, problems with the way they're being managed today. But nevertheless, they are the product of, in fact, when the country can afford it, what do we put on what we used to quaintly call the social wage agenda when you go to dialogue and agreement with employers and with government? And we've got to get back to that.
Thank you. And Bogdan, if I could pick up, because this partnership with civil society, specifically there was the question about public services, but in the interest of time and coverage, generally we've heard about the social dialogue and how well it's working between them and a lot of common ground. How well does it work with you, with NGOs, and as we look to the future, I say the word collaboration, cooperation between all the different actors has come up time and again. What for you is the key to really effective partnerships, both with the social partners, but also with governments, with international organizations? Just because I think we don't have much time, I think it's an important issue to address.
Well, okay, but I think a lot of things have been said already by Sharon. I think social dialogue is crucial. And I was not here all day, but I haven't heard too much about it here today. It's not like you can come in and fly into a country and put up a social protection system. It's built up from the ground, and it's built up by people. And so social dialogue, I think, is a crucial issue and should not be forgotten. And I think to the question from the audience,
back, yeah.
I mean, of course, we sometimes are active in the informal economy and we build up our own little systems of social protection. They're a good start, but I've said already in the introduction, it's not our role to continue this. It should be taken over by government, but again, this can be the start for a social dialogue. And it should also be monitored by civil society, like was said earlier before. It's very important and crucial, because otherwise you will have a government that is not that is not monitored and does not account itself towards the people that use it. And I think it's very crucial that the dialogue is is organized.
And as you say, with the users of it. Roberto, did you want to add anything on that? Then I want to come to the challenges ahead in terms of the final stage of the negotiation and implementation. But on that point.
Well, because it has already been said, but perhaps there was a specific question whether companies, also in relation to public services, for us, and we have repeated it several times, I mean, the public service are an answer to a general interest. There is a public interest there, and it should be, of course, a public-oriented service in terms of also of management, and that's one thing, and that's important and we want to preserve, and also equal access to health, education, childcare is key also for business. I mean, that's also a good sign of oxygen in a society, and mobility, etc. Another thing is how efficient you can be in the managing of these public services. And to some extent, there is a potentiality that can be released in terms of collaboration with the private sector that has not been totally in many occasions.
Thank you. Okay, we are coming to the end of the day, but I want to get a sense from each of you of how you see the challenge ahead. I mean, we've talked about the issues that need to be addressed, and we've talked about why all of this is so very important. But as we move into the final stages of the negotiations on the goals, as we focus now, and we have been all afternoon on the financing and implementation, from your perspectives, from your organization's perspectives, what do you see as the most important challenges in completing negotiations and going forward? And this time, Bogdan, I'd like to start with you. Can you pass the mics back? Thank you.
Thank you. So, well, we have worked a lot on the Millennium Development Goals for the past 15 years, and we are very happy that now we have Sustainable Development Goals, which have in their heart the possibility to fight inequality and to fight climate change, two important things that were not enough in the Millennium Development Goals. What needs to be done is the way social protection is described in the texts from social development goals now should stay in there. It should not be negotiated out of there. And then I think it's very important that it's very well monitored and that the standards don't go down. At least it should be all ILO standards that are monitored, and they should not be replaced by vague social protection definitions. That's, I think, a very important thing up until September.
And beyond? The monitoring?
Yeah, beyond the monitoring, and of course also looking for the necessary funding. And it should, of course, preferably it's taxed on a national base. There are taxes nationally based, but I think there should also an agenda for international better taxation. It has been said in the former panel, but it's it's crucial, and people expect fair taxation, fair international taxation, which can be used for implementation of.
Thank you. So Sharon, hold on to what we've got, if I can put it simply in terms of the negotiations, and then the post-challenge. How do you see the challenge after that?
Well, hold on to what we've got, but also, and I'm sure Bogdan would agree, I know we've worked with HelpAge and others, but the indicators are critical. And particularly for development, the indicators that go to the elements of the social protection floor are absolutely integral to knowing whether we are in fact seeing, integrated systems that build community and economic bases, or if we're just seeing holes plugged. Doesn't mean to say that there aren't indicators for gaps, particularly around gender and migrant workers and others at the higher order in terms of equal treatment. But for me, the passionate social justice piece is the indicators of the elements of the social justice floor. And then Bogdan is right. Will we get a global fund? And it's not for everybody, because I agree with all of those, I'm sure, who've said today. I know I spoke with Guy this morning, so I know he was going to press the point that it's affordable. There is fiscal space in most countries, but for some of the poorest countries, it's such a small amount of money to kickstart the social protection floor as an integrated system, not the safety nets of the World Bank, but an integrated system, that if we're serious in the development financing to come out of ABDIS, and I suspect a long ongoing debate, this will be critical, and we'll carve it out, whether it's by an FTT or by, a contribution system, but we will carve it out and it will be there to kickstart that social protection floor. And my final plug is that without social dialogue, Bogdan's right, I suspect Roberto agrees, without social dialogue, we will not have the champions on the ground to keep the momentum, to see that the systems are strong in design. Doesn't mean you don't need your experts and so on, but if we build another social a CSR industry, $80 billion, and frankly, rights have gone backwards out of this with consultants and experts, then we're not going to make the grade. And let me give you one final piece of optimism. Our global poll shows that between 83 and 87% of people globally, we're talking China, Brazil, the BRICS, the developing countries globally, say that the elements of social protection that we've talked about are amongst the highest priorities that they want their governments to actually intervene and enact. Now, that's a very high call from a broad-based global population.
Thank you very much. Roberto, from your point of view, from employers' point of view, the key challenges ahead.
I will talk on the SDGs in general,
Yep.
Even though I have. Let me very briefly remind you, or could we wonder whether the MDG approach has been successful or not? I think that also would be a relevant question in order to see how. I think that to some extent it has been successful and it has been underlined. If you have read the scientific report of the Secretary General, which is quite interesting, it reflects what are the positive elements of the approach that have been taken. I think that one thing is that the agencies have mobilized and now are much more focused on a specific goal. Another thing is this leadership, the leadership that has been, has come behind also the MDGs. And this is something that we should not lose. What are the risks? The risk is that, and some people have underlined it here in the previous debate, but I have to say it, even though, is that we have now 17 goals and we'll have, sorry to say, 167 targets and then the indicators. So that's going to be a challenging process. So we have to keep this leadership and this capacity to be coherent between the different agencies. And that's not going to be easy, okay? At the same time, the ownership. And the ownership in the case of social protection, and we have to say, and we have to insist, it's not because we don't want to defend our own business, is to preserve this social dialogue approach, which at the end of the day will make a difference.
Okay.
In terms of implementation and in terms of...
So I think I know how you're going to answer my last question. And let's make this in a sentence each. It's been a long day. But for each of you, Bogdan, and I'll start with you, of all the issues we've discussed, all the challenges, what for you is the most important priority if we are to ensure that you hold on to what you've got, as you said, and that you can deliver effective implementation of this? Is it to make sure, this is what I think I might have guessed it slightly, that your voices, that the crucial role that you're playing in terms of the on-the-ground impact is heard, or would you highlight something else as the most important priority?
No, I would highlight that one, but I would say make sure that it is a political discussion and a political agenda for people, and not a management agenda for consultants. I think that is very crucial, and I've heard a lot of one-minute wrap-ups this afternoon, but I think this aspect is very crucial. Make it political, make it for people.
Thank you very much indeed. Roberto?
I would underline the 2 points that we have already underlined. On one side, ownership, and in the case of social protection, you really need the social partners fully involved and with the technical capacity that they need to be involved in many developing countries above all. And secondly, you need to communicate well the business case, and that's also my internal role. And in order to do that, you have to identify what are the real areas in which putting into place a good scheme of social protection will make the difference to dynamize the economy.
Thank you very much. Sharon, you have the last word.
And we need championship. I agree with Bogdan and Roberto, but if we don't have champions amongst, courageous government leader voices, he will get lost in the melee. And the Belgian government, let me, because we're on your soil, put out a challenge here. You are one of the leaders of the ILO's decent work champions, and we need your help to link our goal for full employment and decent work, which is the other element of the dignity of society, to the social protection floor. So champions by governments, both in the north and the economic south, because unless we see that championship, then it gets lost by a lot of other demands. And my final point is, it is a democratic issue. Bogdan's right about the politics of it. You know, if working people pay taxes, what's it for? What's it for if it's not for the services and the support they need for their families and their communities? So it's got to be highly political in all countries, at all levels of the social protection scale. And for the social protection floor, please, government champions that never shut up.
And on that note, a beautiful note upon which to end, and I hate to shut anyone up because we're having such a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your energy at the end.